All right. And Carrie is the community facilitator for the Southeast region of the United States. And I'm going to turn it over to Carrie.
Good deal. Thank you, Allison. Can everyone hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Good deal. Well, we are in an extraordinary time in our nation's history, history being made moment by moment, it seems, and worldwide, ACES Connection has followed the many ongoing protests with regard to the death of George Floyd, 6 weeks ago, I guess it's been since that happened. And, you know, in the midst of this pandemic, people have had shifting priorities, but one big priority now we all know worldwide is how we can build the ties, decrease the tensions between communities and their law enforcement officers. There are many options on the table. Everything from defunding the police, which has a different meaning than what I thought it meant at first. It means to actually reallocate some funds from police to social services or other areas. To people, some calling for the abolishment of the police. But we know that every community has its own special interests and desires, and we ache for communities that are going through so much upheaval right now, and we stand firm in solidarity. We have a First Amendment right to free speech and to peaceful protest, and so we are in support of that. But we're lucky today to have three extraordinary community leader builders. Becky Haas, I met at a SAMHSA workshop almost 2 years ago when I first learned the words handle with care and what that meant. Maggi Duncan, who is the executive director of the Tennessee Association of Chiefs of Police, and then Renee Wilson-Simmons, who leads an incredibly progressive and effective organization in Memphis called ACE Awareness. And she has some very special solutions to community problems of recurrent ACEs, recurrent adverse childhood experiences. So I was glad to see that we had some mayors, at least one mayor on the webinar today. And I know we've got people who work in other positions in city and county government. So thank you so much. Becky Haas is a nationally recognized adverse childhood experiences science initiative builder and trainer. She has worked with law enforcement, with the medical community, the education community, and is in a consulting role now with many different cities, counties, throughout the United States. And as I said, Maggie, Executive Director of the Tennessee Association of Chiefs of Police. So we're going to talk to first Maggie and Becky as they tell us more about what is Handle with Care, what does it mean, where did it come from. So I'm going to turn it over to y'all for about 10 minutes, and then Becky's going to talk for a bit more about what her role is, and then we're going to finish up with some big solutions from Renee Wilson-Simmons. So take it away, ladies. Tell us about Handle with Care.
You want me to start, Becky?
Yeah, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Probably about 4 years ago, we were first introduced to Handle with Care through the West Virginia model, and we started bringing their folks in to train the police chiefs at least once a year. And then they would they would work on their own individual programs in their individual cities. As that continued to grow, we went to having them come in twice a year and working more closely with them. And we presented to some legislators on some things that we were doing, and what came out of that is that the governor's office contacted me and asked me if I would be willing to take it statewide in a consistent platform, something that our association does on a regular basis. So we started that process, and I wrote a grant and received it, and we started basically in January this year, starting to get ready to roll it out, only for COVID to hit. The basis for Handle with Care is to keep it simple, and we constantly tell ourselves that as things get complicated. And the biggest thing on the keeping it simple piece is that it's to give a heads up to for law enforcement to help give a heads up to specific individuals, which generally is the school system, but could be a few other folks depending on the capacity and the resources of those individual communities. And as we move forward, we decided that we were going to have to pivot and change things a little bit. We've known Becky for a number of years and her work with the Johnson City Police Department. And so as we pivot more to focusing on certain types of training, which Becky's going to talk to you about in a minute, we'll be bringing Becky in to help us with that, as we also look at doing that training on the front end instead of after we develop all the policies and the website and everything else. We're going to run things in a parallel motion this time. Maybe not how we would normally do it, but we're going to attempt it this way so that we don't lose any momentum. Becky?
Thank you.
Explain
Go ahead.
with care, Becky, exactly what it is. As a little kid who grew up going to school after my parents would fight sometimes all night long, when I was working on this particular webinar, my tummy hurt so badly because I remembered going to school and just needing to throw up. I was so jangled and jittered up from watching my parents almost kill each other. So tell people how, if I were a little kid today and school were normal, and then we need to talk about what's happening when school is not normal, how would that have helped a little me? Or how would that help?
The Handle with Care, I was privileged to be in the Johnson City Police Department when we rolled that out in 2017. Our chief heard it introduced at a Chiefs Association where, like Maggie said, she had Andrea Darr, one of the co-creators of it from West Virginia, there at a Chiefs conference. And I actually went to high school with Andrea, and I think we were maybe a second location after they really had it going in West Virginia. So I was part of the initial training with our department and with our schools, Johnson City schools and the police together. So basically, it's a simple technique that doesn't really cost any funding. It's just that the police and the school system create a kind of a MOU or some sort of an agreement that they're going to do this together, and that when police have interaction with children that they deem to be traumatic in nature, then they use the chain of communication that they've decided on. In our case, it was an email. We were put off a few months because we couldn't get the form from Handle with Care loaded on our Watson, on our PDF, you know, that the officers use. So we ended up, in order to not delay it anymore, we used a paper form, and lead SRO, that was our point person, and everything went to them. I think the first semester of school we rolled it out, we had about 50. And it's only grown from there. So it's really just a matter of finding a way to communicate. And I know in talking to Maggie about the plan for rolling it out statewide, one of the things that she wants to do is see that departments do it consistently. But basically it's where when children that maybe typically are very engaged in school, you know, referencing Carrie's own personal story, but then one day they come and they're not, they're distracted, or they are, you know, I was on a webinar yesterday training the state of Mississippi child care directors, and you know, if doctors had been misdiagnosing disease in the same way that our educators have deemed things behavior willful, when instead it's survival, you know, how long would we have allowed that to continue? But thankfully now more and more educators are learning about this behavior. So that's what Handle with Care is. And the reason I really love it too is it doesn't give out any information about why the police were there. All it does is list the child's name and Handle with Care. So there's no permanent record of this at all. And then it's left to the school as far as and how they want to approach. Maybe the child comes and they're fine, but maybe they're asleep sleep. Maybe they have the biggest test of the year, and then they just, if the child's just not focused or whatever, then they can kind of try to see if they can reschedule something or work around that. And if need be, connect them to a school counselor. So there's not a pat answer of what the school does with the information, but it's really just a heads up in order to help kids succeed when they have justice involvement.
Yeah.
And let me add to that, if you can hear me.
Yeah.
You know, we here in Memphis, the foundation did try to sort of begin those discussions about Handle with Care and gain some interest. And the one thing that really, I think, registered with folks is when I would say, so if you can imagine, and speaking to teachers, if you can imagine, you come into your classroom and there's a student who maybe has his or her head down, or is starting a fight with another student, or is just not compliant with what is supposed to be going on in the class, and or lashes out at the teacher. And I don't mean physically, but yet perhaps just as a teacher. And I think what would a teacher do if they knew nothing about the circumstances around that student's behavior and said, you're out of here, go to the principal or go to the assistant principal, this is unacceptable. But what if you knew that the night before there was an incident at that student's house and the police were there, and maybe one of their parents was taken away, was arrested, or it was a domestic violence incident and one parent's taken away and the others going to the hospital, and the student acted in any of those ways I just described. My hope is that you would do something different, and my belief is you'd do something different. But if you don't know that anything has happened, and you don't have to know the specifics, just the fact that something has happened, you need to handle that student with care. It's really that simple, and I think that really resonates with people.
Thank you. And y'all, that's Renee Wilson-Simmons, and she's going to talk to us some more about one of the solutions Memphis has to actually weave some other supports in with helping the police help families. But that's exactly it, because I would go to school and I would check out, because when a kid is traumatized, they're either going to disassociate, or they're going to be hypervigilant, or they're going to obsess, or they're going to act compulsively. And Allison's nodding her head because she knows this comes from one of our favorite authors, Pete, oh, come on, Carrie, out. Pete Walker, who's written a book on complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And so checking out, I mean, I wondered why I never could get algebra. Well, I wasn't there. I was on the ceiling or outside or somewhere else. And so if my teachers had known, but not with a gossip background, like, oh, did you hear he beat the out of her again? None of that stuff, just a quiet, dignified allowing of some vitally important information to be transmitted to key people who then would not re-traumatize an already traumatized child by saying, sit down and take this test, and I don't care if you don't want it or not, we're doing spelling today, or we're doing math. So tell us more about that, Becky. How are you all, Becky and Maggie, being met by police departments when you go and you take this in? Because police are like this right now. They feel like they're really, no pun intended, but under the gun.
So we're still working with, I believe, you have to work from the top down and from the bottom up. So we're working the top down right now. From what we can tell, the majority of our police departments and our chiefs are 100% on board, and we're moving forward. What I realized is that in developing our program is not just going straight in like, here's the policy, this is how we're going to do things. But if they didn't understand it, what an adverse childhood experience was, then we weren't going to really get very far. So we have started training the police chiefs on ACEs and building strong brains in Tennessee. And it has made a huge difference, because then they start to it's not just, oh, this program is really going to benefit the children and our community and our school systems, but now they realize there's a bigger piece to it. And so with Becky's help, we're working on creating a training for law enforcement statewide in different mediums now that we have COVID, so that we can do trauma, so we can be training our police officers across the state of Tennessee on ACEs, which then leads into trauma-informed policing, so that they better understand that piece. And the more they understand about trauma that other people have, then they may do a better job of understanding the trauma that they experience.
Yep.
Instead of shutting down. And so I'm utilizing Handle with Care's ability to do some things that normally would look like they were outside our scope, but they're in our scope now, as we are moving forward on our the partnership that we have formed with our governor on law enforcement reform. And we're utilizing some of these things in that, because a large part of being able to have positive community and officer interactions and better relationships with your community is understanding your community. And part of understanding your community is being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And how better do you do that? By learning. And I look at the ACEs program and trauma-informed policing practices as something that will do exactly that. So it'll be one piece of the multi-level piece or multi-tiered system that we're working on as we move Tennessee law enforcement forward.
And
Great.
to
Thank you.
Maggie's, to Maggie's point, because I was embedded in a police department when we were rolling out Handle with Care, the program itself does not actually require the police to be trained in trauma-informed care. But I really think Maggie has a vision for stepping it up a notch, and I saw that too. I felt, we could ask the officers to do this, and yes, they know some of the kids have hardship, but if they really understood what trauma, and even for many of the drug crimes, that really trauma is the gateway drug when you understand ACEs. And so, we're still going to do our job and enforce the law, but now in judges that I've worked with, juvenile judges and all, we're helping them to see that maybe we need to have some resources to treat the trauma while they're in the process. So, so while I was at the police department, some of it happened organically as a mother and now a grandmother. When I heard a 911 call of a 4-year-old watching their mother being beat with a ball bat, I thought to myself, who's going to help that child? And I guess I knew from writing a Family Justice Center grant at our police department, what I knew that it would be 7 acts of violence before someone would reach out for an advocate. And I thought, who is there to help the child on the first violent occasion or second or third? And I thought only police are. And so if a police officer was trained, because what happens is that little child didn't see that their father would be arrested by them calling the police. So now the child has a terrible burden of guilt. And so there wasn't a trauma-informed police training that I was aware of in 2017. And so through a lot of research, I found out there was a lot out there that their peers were saying. Some of it came from the International Chiefs Association, where they recommend officers understand tactical breathing. I'd been teaching mental health experts, and they'd been talking to me about the power of deep breathing for a long time, but now we frame it up as tactical breathing for our officers. And I have some great stories of SROs in interactions with kids at school in a fight, and they ask the child to sit down and let's practice blowing up a balloon, and there's no balloon around, but the officer gets it now. They need to move the child to the upstairs part of the brain. And so I think it's going to be more comprehensive in rolling out Handle with Care in Tennessee to include the training. And so I'm really tickled to be, part of this work.
Great, and thank you, Becky, because it's important to think about the fact that when prisoners are asked about their number of ACEs, that prisons are filled with people who have experienced 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 adverse childhood experiences. And our Better Normal next week, when we talk with Dr. Mimi Graham of Florida State University and Judge Lynn Teppert there, where they're trying to help not see so many children go into the child welfare system where they may be further traumatized. But the more that we can reduce trauma, that's when we're really doing our job. And that is we're gonna get back to the root of it in just a minute with Renee. But tell me just a little bit, Becky, about a little bit more about the police. Is there an aha moment as you've gone into Oklahoma or done webinars with Oklahoma and other police departments? What happens with that aha moment? Because I have the belief that just as we know, many people in 12% of people have experienced 4 or more ACEs, but 64% of people have ACEs. So that look that comes from police officers, have they ever said, oh, I had that too? Or do you hear that, or is there a lot of bravado?
Good question. Well, fortunately, before I went to work at the police department, I had a job that was funded by the Governor's Highway Safety Office, and the grant was at East Tennessee State University, but I trained officers in 33 counties of Tennessee on car seat safety. So I wasn't a stranger to training officers, but I knew that to train officers, you either had to be an officer or one of their peers. And so that's why I was very careful to find content that I knew came from their peers. And it was messaging that was from law enforcement to law enforcement on why we needed to understand about trauma. And I found that the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has a video, an officer training video on 5 core messages around domestic violence. And another thing, I think this is kind of a critical piece too here, Carrie, is an aha moment for officers is officer self-care. 2 of the biggest leading documents on police reform in the last few years, one was the 21st century policing model that came under President Obama's administration. The other one is the new era of public safety that was released within a couple years ago. And of all the pillars they recommend in both of those documents on reform, it's all about officer wellness. And I've trained Oklahoma City Police Department. I'm getting ready to train West Virginia that's doing an initiative that's around police and community. But I've been really shocked how that, and I knew from working in a police department, the general orders required debriefing if you use your service weapon. But if you responded to, a child drowning or a car fatality or a train fatality, officers feel they have to just soldier on. So I think for me, a lot of the training, when I come to the self-care piece, in 2018 and 2019, both, more officers took their own life than were killed in the line of duty. And that's a huge aha moment. And so here we are talking about trauma and how it affects people in the community, people that officers are arresting, but then we talk about trauma in their own life. And I think having all that packaged together, I also give some examples of what trauma-informed policing looks like. I know Maggie knows, and Renee may as well, David Roddy, Chief Roddy, it's over in Chattanooga. And he's when he went to Chattanooga, he did a little bit of assessing of what maybe their department was weak in, and they saw they needed youth programs. So they started Bigs in Blue, which is Big Brother, Big Sister, which is a great program for officers to be mentoring kids. And Chief Roddy himself is one of the mentors. So, so in my training, I brought in tactical breathing, what is trauma, weaved in some SAMHSA stuff about brain development, and then some examples, current examples of what is trauma-informed policing, and how to reduce trauma on scene for children in domestic violence or other type things as well. And then we look at the end, officer self-care. And also I found a wonderful assessment called Professional Quality of Life Scale, which helps compassion professionals see if they have compassion satisfaction, compassion fatigue, or secondary trauma, which is very dangerous for officers. And there's also a free app you can download on your phone called Provider Resilience that has that, that scoring assessment tool in it. And it's nothing you have to talk to your supervisor about, but it just helps you see, like a tire with the pressure, air pressure too low. My light comes on in my car, it freaks me out. My husband's like, calm down, it's like 2 pounds, you know? And that's what it helps the officers see if the stress of the job. So when I was training Oklahoma City Police Department, they downloaded that app on 1,200 phones while I was there so that officers could use it as a tool.
Wow. Well, Becky, that's those are some great points for the mayor and city officers and county people who are on this call to think about things that they can do to support their police, because they are in a very stressful job. And as we know, many of them come out of a trauma background too. But when we get down to root cause, you know, trauma had to start somewhere. I cannot recommend this book, My Grandmother's Hands, highly enough. We are actually reading it, the staff at ACES Connection, and we'll be discussing it during the month of August, but by Resma Menachem. And in it, he talks about kind of the root of a lot of trauma in the United States, that it started with, you know, feudal Europe, the feudal times in Europe when people were actually serfs, and that was how they got to live, they were actually indentured or virtually worked as slaves to stay alive on the land that the landed people, the wealthy people, owned. And in this book, he talks about white body trauma, black body trauma, and police body trauma. Renee, have you read this book? I'm not trying to.
I have not.
Well, I cannot recommend it enough. And
I wrote down the title. I'll be definitely checking it out.
I'll be sending it to you, and I'll put the link in. I highly recommend the Audible version because Carrie Heiss is an actor who narrates it, and it is just a wonderful listen to listen to it. But Renee, the root of trauma, and Memphis is a town that is a city that you know, was agricultural, a lot of root of slavery, historic trauma, and oppression. And I'm sorry, I thought I had muted my phone, pardon me. But this gets carried on from generation to generation. And I know that you are doing some things in Memphis, working with first responders, police, and other services, resources. Tell us about what you're doing, what Memphis's ACE awareness is, and what are these universal parenting places that to me sound like something that, oh my God, I wish my family could have just rolled into one of those and had you there to put your arms around us and teach us how to love each other.
So now I would love to do that. And will I be able to pull up my slides? Can you share? I mean, do I have to click share screen? Do you have to click it? I have a couple of slides to actually show you some of the universal parenting places.
That's great. Allison will give you permission to share your screen.
Yeah, I think you should be able to, just because I made you a co-host. So it seems like you should be able to have sharing options, but if not. Okay.
Oh yeah, there it is. Oh, don't look. Wait. Okay. Oh, look at that. All right. Okay. Okay, so and just very briefly, we truly believe that a child is a child of everyone. That's the belief on which the ACE Awareness Foundation is built. And our objectives are really to educate Greater Memphis about ACEs, and then both to develop as well as implement efforts that prevent ACEs, that mitigate their negative effects, because we really want to promote the healthy development of children and the nurturing nature of families. And beyond that, we really want to be an advocate for systems change, because we know that's what really makes the difference over time, that we have to change systems. You know, if we get an individual to change, or even an organization or institution, that's not enough. We really need systems change. And so those are the things that we are focusing on as a foundation. And in terms of promoting healthy development, it's really, we're looking from the roots up, and the way in which we believe we can support the healthy development of children, families, and communities is through our universal parenting places. And that's because we believe that children do better when parents do better.
Yeah. So putting.
And so these are all photographs from our universal parenting places, and we call them judgment-free centers. These are places where parents, grandparents, any other family members who are actually caregivers can go. They can receive counseling from a licensed clinical social worker, information, emotional support. They can engage in stress reduction activities, parent-child bonding activities. There are support groups and sort of other kinds of social support building programs that really help promote social connections and decrease isolation, and also to obtain referrals, because one organization or one service can't be all things to all people. So that's what we do. So you see the old boy with his dad or his granddad. One of the sites does Donuts with Dads, which is a monthly event. The women around the mat are doing stroller strides with their newborns. They exercise with the children in their strollers to actually do exercise for them in connection with their child. There's in the middle, there's a support group meeting with the purple mats is Baby and Me Yoga. So parents come with their, and it's usually the mothers come with their children. And really what those UPPs are doing is really utilizing the latest research we have around neurobiology, around family therapy, to really address the kinds of concerns that parents have and evidence-based interventions, and providing them with guidance and support, trying to help them reduce their stress, because we know their stress affects their children. We're talking about intergenerational trauma, and also helping them build the kinds of bonds and just relaxing. So again, at the top, and this is a young man in Baby and Me Yoga, the parents are doing pickleball with their children, and another one is playtime. And there are 4 of them in Memphis. One is at, and we were trying to, at the start, there are only 4, but to try to put them in different types of settings to see how a model would work in a hospital. So this is Baptist Memorial Hospital, in a community-based organization, which is Knowledge Quest, at a school, which is a pre-K and elementary school. And Christ Community Health Services is a federally qualified health center. It's in one of the 8 centers that are in Memphis. So that's what we are doing. And we talked about COVID. So they're not open. So we've developed a telehealth protocol, and the counseling is continuing as telehealth, and continuing to provide those other sort of support services that now can't happen face to face. So each of the QPPs takes 1 p.m. on days to do their online programming. So there's still parent support group, there's still yoga and meditation. There's still mindfulness. There's still, and we hadn't done this before, toddler and preschool story time, which has become very popular. And we are going to think very differently when all of this is over. Well, all of it's never going to be over, but when we're able to come back together again, because usually for our parent support groups or any of these, what we call alternative therapies, maybe there will be 10, 15, 20 folks participating. For these Facebook Live events, we're getting an average of 500 people. Wow. So yes, so we have to think differently. And for the telehealth counseling, some of the sites are getting more requests. And in both cases, now you don't have to worry about childcare. You don't have to worry about transportation, as long as you can have a space where you can, for the counseling, be able to do that. And some folks are doing it from their car because they don't have the space in their house for the kind of privacy that they need. So we have learned a lot from and moving forward about what we need to do differently.
Well, Renee, and I know that Memphis is so thrilled to have you there because you bring decades of experience in working in this area and having studied it, and with being a doctor of public health. So I know Memphis is very glad to have you there. I'm wondering though, for all of you, how is COVID changing how this is going to happen, because if a little kid's not going to school where he or she spaces out and stares out the window or is acting out, and truly the compulsivity or obsession being some of the ways that trauma expresses itself, how is that going to work? Because it's not like a little kid can send a handle with care to the police himself or herself. They're stuck at home with their parents. So Renee, I love what you're doing, that providing some support and services now. How can the police be supportive in this situation, Becky and Maggie?
I think we're grappling with that on a regular basis right now because we're in a different atmosphere, especially in the fact that our numbers, before COVID, we only tracked our crime numbers and calls, a service that we submit to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation on a monthly basis. And during the beginning part of COVID, the thought was, what if we got them weekly? And so somehow I got tasked with making that happen for all the agencies and the software companies. And we worked really, really diligently. And now they're getting information on a weekly basis. Keeping that in mind, they're able to utilize that information. And that's how law enforcement's using it. They're utilizing that information instead of getting something that's 5 weeks ago, that was for a whole month. They're getting stuff that's, basically 7 or 10 days after. And they're looking at those numbers and they're seeing in what parts, in what areas of town they're having what issues that have to do with different types of violence, and trying to interact at that and intersect at that level. So depending if you have a family justice center, which some of our cities in Tennessee do, they're working with those family justice centers to try to get some level of help to them outside of any other normal way that we used to do things. We're taking data-driven information and we're driving ourselves to finding help, trying to get help to those individuals before something worse happens. Because by the time in the past we would get that information, it'd be a month's worth, it'd be 5 weeks after a lot of that had happened.
Right, and this is tough to answer, but Becky, with Black Lives Matter being front and center and long needing to have been front and center, it's a shame in this nation that it takes tragedies to jar us into our sensibilities, that we don't start out as Representative John Lewis, who was laid to rest yesterday, called, we don't start out in a beloved community. Though it sounds as though that's really a lot of what Renee is trying to create. But how has this changed the sensitivity and the need for officers to learn empathy? Can you teach empathy to an officer?
Oh. Well, in the training, I was very fortunate when I was at the police department. The chief that I worked with is now retired, but when the Ferguson shootings and the Baltimore riots erupted, we had a visit from our president of our local NAACP, Mr. Davis, a kind gentleman that became a very dear friend who's passed on now. But he came to meet with Chief, and he wanted to know how in Johnson City we could be ahead of this. We could have, conversations and transparency and all. So we formed a group called Community Roundtable, and the chief handpicked me to be a part of that. And I worked to grow police community relationships. The police training that I do also has about how to connect, how to grow cultural competencies in a police department. Actually, in Johnson City, our Hispanic population is larger than our African-American population. We have a lot of large migrant farms here. So I made good, strong relationships with Catholic charities and the agencies that serve them. And so once a month, we had a meeting with the faith community. Black Lives Matter was invited, the Jewish community. We had a rabbi that would come, Muslim community. We had the LGBTQ. We had you name it, the FBI, we had university folks, and we had some amazingly transparent conversations. We started a program called Coffee with a Cop, and we would go to downtown businesses, we would go to inner city churches, and we would just, no agenda, no speeches, because I had read some reports about riots in Cincinnati back in 2000, and I believe the feds came in and talked to the chief there because it was around some acts of brutality, and they said there's got to be reform. And one of the reports I read, the chief said, we thought we had relationships with the community, but we realized they were only surface. And to your point, Carrie, about beloved community that we're hearing a lot about with Representative Lewis's passing, that's what we realized we needed to do. So these became friendships. So in 2015, I was honored to work with the NAACP and the faith community, and we started a first ever, it's an annual Martin Luther King Unity March. We've had our university president, every mayor that's been in office since then, the chief, and we march. The pastors wanted to make it also a prayer time, and it's a great event. And when I went to healthcare in 2018, I was super sorry to have to miss that event. But you know, activities like that involve police. One more thing that I'll add is that the ACE Connection have a wonderful equity tool. And if you're in a community, growing a community, one of the things with the equity tool is it shows you, make sure no one's left out from the table. And probably one of the more popular reasons people reach out to me is how to get law enforcement involved.
Right. Sorry, I lost you for just a second here, but I'll be back. But Allison, do you want to throw it open to the group and let them
Yeah,
see?
let me call on Leslie first, Leslie Peters, who just left a comment, and I'm going to unmute you and feel free to share your comment with the group, your question. I clicked, yeah, there we go. Oh no, okay, Leslie, I unmuted you, and then I think you just have to click accept.
Sorry, my phone froze. I'm like, oh no, let me get it. So, hi, how are you doing? Thank you so very much. The comment I posted is because I left for a couple of years ago to kind of do this on my own. I wasn't sure what direction I was going. The comment I made is about a program I put together. I spent 30 years working with low-income families as a home care OB nurse. And I saw a lot of the issues from a whole different perspective than I did when I worked in the hospitals. And what I saw was that even the model I created is more of a self-awareness and communication. Because what I saw is, we have great programs, but unless we get to the foundation, there's like a lot of these women, I don't know about the men, I only dealt with the women. A lot of these women have this like huge gaping hole that we just keep putting Band-Aids on. And I didn't know how I did what I did, but I was able to help them. And after the fact, when I say to them, like, you know, what is it I did for you outside being a nurse? I was trying to find a label for what I do. And they all just say, you taught me to love myself. I'm like, shoot, how did I do that? Like, and what it was actually just quite simple. And that's what this heart model is founded in. It's like really just validating them for humanness first, not brokenness, having the honest conversations, being real, not worrying about being politically correct. And it's about like just treating the people as equals. So the heart model is a several phase. It's pretty much a self-awareness program, but it incorporates, I think first is like ACE's training, intro self-awareness. Second are conversations I did. Third's giving them accountability partners. So someone's always just touching it and they don't feel alone. I want to get this instituted. I envisioned it as I was creating it, going into like a WIC or some type of program. Any ideas on the best way to find collaboration for this? Because I've just been kind of throwing darts out there and seeing.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Leslie, where is your program?
I'm based in Philadelphia, but it can all be done online, you know, until the last couple phases are like retreats, but the first 4 phases can all be done actually 5 can all be done virtually.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anyone want to respond?
So the question is, how could you, I was listening so intently on you describing it. Your question is, how could you integrate it with other community partners outside of healthcare?
I think that is her question, yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, you know, here in Northeast Tennessee and rural Appalachia now, where more and more agencies have been trained, probably 15, 17, 20,000 people, professionals, and the healthcare system, the university, where we just, you know, community partners, and we make them aware
Okay.
of opportunities. And oftentimes we had a program came from Michigan called Mom Power with a new professor that moved here, and she'd been a part of the ground level of it launching in Michigan. And now there's Mom Power at the library. So a lot of times we, just like when I would speak at health councils and you would hear about, you know, programs and availability. So I would encourage you to get on the agenda of some of those type cohort meetings and let people know about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Becky,
you.
for responding. Yeah. Okay, so we got one more comment question from Nikita. So let me unmute you. Go for it.
Hey. I think, well, my question mostly answered it, like what I wrote out. That was the main thing, is that I think this trauma-informed training for police officers is great, but then is there an aspect of it where you talk about kids who have faced trauma because of the police, and then having discussions around that and like the historical background of the police and why there is this distrust? And because, you know, I think you gave an example of a child who might have experienced a domestic violence situation. And that's a really great example. And the police would be the first person of contact that the child would probably see after. But if it's a child who had that, but then also their uncle passed away because of police brutality, and now they're meeting a police officer, that's going to be a very different relationship. So yeah, thank you.
I would say in the training is also looking at how you respond. I think law enforcement often is considered the warrior to some degree, that they're not to have emotion, that things aren't supposed to affect them. And so that may come across that way. And so being more compassionate and your response and how you respond, and that how you respond to somebody can greatly impact how they will be impacted by that event. So that is part of that police informed training. And I know that Becky can probably talk a little bit more to that. You know, an incident where you may have had a family member or someone that you know that may have been harmed by police is obviously a totally different topic and a totally different scenario that I don't know that I have the answer for that, because that is going to probably be very difficult of how you train that. I think what we do is we work really diligently from this point forward as a profession to try to, in certain scenarios, limit those uses of force. But there's some levels of use of force that happen, and you may have a relative who could be killed at the hands of a police officer, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't warranted. And I don't like to use the word warranted, but that there wasn't a situation that use of force was required. But in a use of force, some of the things that we've seen on the news and whatnot, I don't know that there's any law enforcement people that I know that think that what has happened that we've seen on the news, like with George Floyd and cases of that nature, none of us think that was right. Mm-hmm. And we're all going back to the table. None of our policies are training any of that in our state, but we're going back to the table and we're making sure they know these are the only techniques you may use, and these techniques should never be used. And so that's coming back to you have to come back to the drawing board, and you have to figure out what can you do? Because you can't always go for every single scenario, but what can we do to try to limit those scenarios in the future?
And I would just add, we were not, oh, I'm sorry, Becky.
No, go ahead, Renee.
So we had not move towards implementing Handle with Care here in Memphis. So I'll be interested to see how it moves forward with Maggie's group and Becky helping with that. But what we were trying to do, and what Carrie referred to, was we are talking with the Memphis mayor now around ways that we can work with both the police and the EMTs who go to houses where there's going to be an issue when the police are involved, for them to get some understanding of ACEs and trauma, because they were saying, well, just give us your information about the universal parenting places, and when we go, we'll share that. But we were saying that it needs to be much more than that, sort of their understanding of why they're even handing it out, an understanding of what ACEs are and around trauma, and also to create a video, because as we are now, they're not going to have the opportunity to go to see our UPP, but we want to have a video so they can see the site. They can hear some of the parents talk about what a difference it's made, so they can see the value of it, and they're not just handing something out. So that's what we're working on now.
That's awesome, Renee. And it is so important, to Renee and Maggie's point. And in the training, that was such a good question, Nikita, I point out how that a public safety, a crime prevention technique is for officers to build relationships with children. Because if you're on that force 10, 15 years more, that is going to be your adult population. And you know who it's most disturbing to see police brutality are police with integrity.
Yeah.
It's very upsetting to police to see brutality, because there are so many police that are in our schools helping with math. I had officers, we did a thing, party with the park, and giving rides to seniors, and officers, it's very, very distressing to them to see the instances of brutality. So in the training, I actually point out about relationships with children, and I would take officers anywhere we were invited. And back in the time, Ferguson and Baltimore and Dallas, where officers were shot, and other incidents where people of color, there was brutality, we would have little children, 8 years old, ask an officer, when's the last time you executed somebody? And officers are very aware that the perception that the children and the youth in the community have of officers is only set by one factor, themselves. And so we're really trying to get out there and do that messaging, and our officers would pull up on a cul-de-sac if there's a bunch of youth, maybe they heard or out at after curfew, and start playing basketball with them, and try to get some rapport. And so yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah.
Excellent.
All right, well, Carrie, you're muted.
Thanks, Allison. Sometimes I feel like we're just we're juggling knives in a upside down room covered in ball bearings and as we do these webinars, trying to do so many things at one time, but we are almost out of time, and I just in closing wanted to ask one last question of Renee, and I want to thank Maggie and Becky so much for being with us, but we had someone who really wanted to know how the UPPs got started, Renee. So if you could make that part of your closing remarks, that would be
Sure. And you know what? It's a very interesting story. The original ACEs study that happened with Kaiser Permanente and in the late 1990s, just to understand the way in which ACEs has an impact long-term over people's health. And there came together a group of leaders, not just nonprofit, but sort of business and academia, that were concerned about the health status of Memphians. And they decided to have a survey conducted that was similar to that initial one. And they contracted with Public Health Management Corporation, which is a research firm in Philadelphia, to conduct a random digital survey, an ACEs survey of residents of Shelby County. And it was a representative sample of about 1,500 respondents and found that 50% at least had one ACE, I want to say 20% had 2 to 3, 12% had 4 or more. And out of that, they determined that we need to do something differently. And they understood, as I said earlier, that children do better when their parents do better. And they felt like there needed to be a way to have opportunities for parents to get the support they need. And they, out of that group, which was the Shelby County ACE Aware Task Force, ACEs Task Force, they created the foundation, the ACE Awareness Foundation, and the foundation developed the model and began with the, 2 universal parenting places and now 4. And the foundation actually gave seed funding to a clinic in the Delta in Leland, Mississippi, and that one is actually self-sustaining at this point. But we have a generous donor, but now we're seeking funding beyond that. But that's all came about by a group of folks concerned that became a task force and did their own work to see that we needed to do something differently and supported that.
Right, and you know, I'm going to close out with a quote that I shared on a call the other day that I love by a woman named Lillian Katz, who said, and I think about this because police officers, they were little girls and little boys themselves at one point, and they were scared. But that each of us must come to care about everyone's children. We must recognize that the well-being of our own children is intimately linked to the well-being of all other people's children. After all, when one of our children needs life-saving surgery, someone else's child will perform it. When one of our children is harmed by violence, someone else's child will have committed it. The good life for our own children can be secured only if it is also secured for all other people's children. But to work for the well-being of all children is not just a practical matter, it is also a right. And that is by a woman named Lillian Katz, and I just love it. And I will, look up Lillian Katz, and each of us must come to care about everyone else's children. I'll put it in the chat while Allison closes us out, but I just cannot thank you all enough. This was a big group. We had at one point, I think 95 people on the call. So I appreciate it so much to try to help us realize that hurt people, and got to stop somewhere, and it's got to stop with us. Not hurting ourselves, thank you, Leslie Peters, and being kind to officers and others. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allison.
All right. Thank you so much, Becky, Maggie, Renee, and Carrie. This was such an important conversation to be having. And thank you all for being here and for all of your discussion comments in the chat. I apologize that we didn't get to even a small fraction of you, but we are so grateful for your participation, because that is what community is all about, is learning and growing from each other. So thank you so much. I hope that you will join us again for A Better Normal. The way that you can see the upcoming Better Normals is if you go to our homepage and you look on the right-hand side and you scroll down a little bit, and you'll see there's like a little area that says upcoming webinars. And so you'll see that, and you can sign up for next week's events. So we hope to see you back here next week, and I hope that you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank
you. Allison, is that if people want to save the chat, they can save the chat by clicking on the little buttons down below, and that's how they can find some of the resources that were listed. The little buttons to the right, chat.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go. Thank you all.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.